I want to ask you a couple questions about our beloved SoFi.
Okay.
And I already asked Chris this question, and I answered. I told my.
I was listening to the stream for about 5 or so minutes, so I heard the what 3 questions. Is that the?
Let's start there. If you had the pleasure, because he'd be more interested in talking with somebody like you than somebody like me that knows the company on a very surface level, what 3 questions would you ask Anthony Noto?
Man, that's such a hard question. I would love to know more about like markets in general, and even earnings calls and everything else are so focused on just the next quarter and even maybe in the next year. I would love to hear his vision, a greater in-depth part of his vision for what he wants this to look like 5 and 10 years down the road. Like he said things like, we want to be a top 10 financial institution, right? By market cap. That means that they, like, to me, that seems to mean that they can't just do that being a consumer facing company only. So like, what is the roadmap for the products? Where do you see, like, and we kind of have gotten some of this. They've talked about international expansion. They've talked about business account, like, but it's all been really kind of just hand wavy, right? Like there's been no predefined roadmap. And what is he like, where does he see the company in 10 years? Like what would, if he could build it and everything went according to plan, what would it look like? That'd probably be one of the ones that I'd ask him. Let's see, what else? I mean, I'd love to know. So, for example, the Technisys acquisition kind of caught me off guard just because I'm not in the finance space, right? Like, at least not, I'm aware of it because of everything that, because I've done so much DD on SoFi. But like, what other pieces of technology do they not have that they would need in order to kind of fill out their vertical tech stack? Would be another kind of question that I'd ask.
So you're saying that Galileo and Technisys might not be sufficient. You want to know what holes they need to fill? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if there are holes that they need to fill, or if they feel like this is, they can build the rest internally or that sort of thing. Because like, I didn't know what a banking core was until they, bought Technisys, and then I had to go and figure out what it meant.
I still don't know. Yeah. Can you do it in layman's terms for people like
I was going to say, can we start there? Because my first lay on Technisys. So,
so Technisys, at least again, this is my understanding of it. So a banking core is it runs the ledger and all of the back end of a bank. So this is like everything that you need in order to keep the books clean, in order to make sure that the processes are run accurately, that is reporting all of the transactions accurately. And a lot of these older ones that run, so that kind of the industry standard that's been built in the past is run on really archaic technology. So I actually in my job, I use a program. The program I use most is built in Fortran. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that language, but it's like from the 70s, right? 60s and 70s. And it's still built in that. And to give you an example, like in my company, we were syncing everything to the cloud because that's what you do, right? And we were having all these problems with like our simulations would all of a sudden throw us these weird errors that we didn't know anything about. And we finally got in contact with somebody, and they're like, and like we'd gone through all these troubleshooting things, and they're like, oh, you're not trying to sync to the cloud, are you? And we're like, of course we're trying to sync to the cloud. Like that's where we save all our files. And the way that the file structure is done, it's so archaic that like it has like hundreds of subfiles that it's constantly updating. And then when it like pulls them all together and then uploads them. But the problem is that then it will like break that file back apart in order to like get those subfiles back when it's actually running the program. And so as it syncs to the web, it would like corrupt these files. And so like all these simulations, we wasted thousands of hours on this because it's built on something that had no idea what the cloud was or the internet was. That's kind of how I think of like what Technisys could replace on the core banking. So like a lot of the things that they run are programmed in COBOL, which is again like a programming language from the 1960s, 1970s. But the point is, like, the banks have to run these programs every single day in order to make sure that everything adds up, in order to report it properly through the proper channels, in order to make sure that all the transactions went through, and all of that kind of back-end system. That's what the banking core is. And again, kind of the legacy way to do this is each individual product had its own individual core. And so, like, if you had a brokerage, you had to have a core for that. If you had savings accounts, you'd have to do one for that. If you had debit cards, you'd have to do one for that. And this new architecture is cloud-based, and it allows you to have multi-products on the same core, so that then you can also, so instead of having to, so you don't have siloed data, right? Is kind of one of the most important parts of that, so that you know exactly. So like, if my data on SoFi is in a multi-product core, they can pull up everything from my credit card and my brokerage account and my checking and savings and everything else, and have access to that data to be able to then, serve me better as a client. Did that answer the question about what a banking core is?
Yeah, that was actually the best it's ever been explained to me. Yeah, that was very helpful.
Sounds exciting. Is it worth $1 billion?
That's
what they say, right?
So okay. That gets into a different question, which is how much is it worth, right? So I actually think
I'm here to ask the dick questions. The rich guy in the room that's got a lot of shares, and I'm trusting Noto with my livelihood here, and I want answers to the tough shit. Now, I'm not here to make friends.
That's fine.
Well, I think his answer is going to be no, because I think the write-offs came from Technisys, but you're going to know better than me.
The goodwill, or is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. So there was the goodwill write-off, but the thing is, so probably the best public companies that you could say are similar to Galileo would be Marqeta, who's an issuer processor, which is something that we haven't talked about yet, right? But an issuer processor, these are the people who print your debit cards and process the transactions on your debit cards. And that's what Galileo started out as. And they also do like ACAT transfers, which is like when you transfer from one bank to another, and other similar type of transactions. Anyway, so Marqeta is similar to Galileo. There's also another company that does banking as a service that's similar in a lot of the things they do to Galileo. That's called nCino. The ticker is NCNO. And the crazy part is the revenue between SoFi and nCino is actually, between Galileo. So if you just take the tech platform alone, and they're at almost the same revenue, like total revenue run rate that Galileo's at. Their growth rates are similar. Galileo's growth rate is actually slightly more, and they're valued at, I should pull it up because I don't want to get it wrong, but I think they're valued at like a price to sales of something around, well, let me look it up so I don't get it wrong. And I have it in an article somewhere too. But anyway, the point is, give me a second.
I get things wrong on this channel all the time, bro. You don't have to be that precise.
Anyway, the point is, I think that like, if I remember correctly, it was something like $3 billion is what they're worth. And they are very, very similar. Sorry, so they're like $3.6 billion is their market cap. And again, their revenue is really close, and they're growing actually slightly slower than Galileo is right now. So if you were to just say, what's Galileo worth by itself, probably the best comp is this nCino company, and it's about $3.6 billion by itself.
That's like half SoFi, about 40% of SoFi, right?
Yeah, like 40% of SoFi, right?
It's crazy.
And that's not accounting for any of the customer facing anything.
Wow. So going back to these three questions, what does SoFi look like in 5 to 10 years? And then is there anything that's missing for the flywheel, if you will, right? Because y'all use this terminology, the flywheel. So those are two questions. What's your third question?
I don't know.
And
I mean, there's a million like nitpicky questions, but like, I wouldn't want to waste, it's like the genie, right? Like, if you've only got 3 wishes, you got to think about those wishes. If I only get 3 questions,
I want to understand my wife question. That question.
Exactly, right?
I'll let you sleep on it, and we'll get going. And if something comes up as we're on our way, let's talk about it. I've got some more questions here. I'm like a journalist, and I'm halfway prepared for this. So here's a question for you, because you are probably the most bullish person that I know that invests in SoFi. But I feel like your bullish nature came because you did all the research. Whereas people like me are bullish because I don't see another place that I can make this much money in the next 3 to 5 years.
Uh-huh.
And I think that Noto is the guy to quarterback this thing. Like this was the moat and all that stuff. No, this was, for me, it was more than anything, it was a management play. They had the right situation at the right company, and they got the right man for the job. So to me, they filled that hole, because nothing happens without the right captain. Without the right person steering the boat, if you will. And I think that they have the perfect man for the job. And then when I saw the way that the PSUs were lined up, as you and Tanner and Tevis and Roy Crossroads, all you guys did an awesome job of explaining that to us. I was like, dude, this dude's positioned to get paid, and guess what? I'm gonna get paid too. To me, it was just that simple. The bull case started forming. But how big, like on a scale of 1 to 10, I feel like your bull case is a 10. Just me from the outside looking in, but this isn't the question. The question is, what would have to happen for that bull case to be shattered, and for Chris to say, hey, you know what? I got it wrong. Because, I mean, my goodness, dude, I feel like you're willing to debate anybody on X if they even talk the slightest shit about SoFi. I want to know, what would make you eat the most crow that you've eaten in your whole life?
If they stop executing, right? Like, I think that most of the conviction is from the fact that, like, I've been watching them through really difficult times as a company, like through things that, like, they probably shouldn't have survived through, honestly. And they've continued to execute. They've continued to grow. Like everything else, with the exception of maybe like Affirm. Affirm has done a pretty good job also. But SoFi's executed better. But Affirm also didn't have the headwinds that SoFi had, right? So like if you go back to 2020, right, and SoFi's student loan business was something like 60% of their revenue.
Right.
And you take any other company and you take away 60% of their revenue, like, and you come back 3 years later and you say, what happened to that company? It wouldn't be, it tripled in revenue, right? And tripled is an over exaggeration. It about doubled in revenue in that time, but it's tripled since about 2021 until now. And so like the point is that they've been, and then you had the rate hike cycle on top of that, which should have, and so if you look at all their competitors, so you look at Upstart, you look at Robinhood, you look at Lending Club, you look at all of them saw a downturn. Like in 2022, Robinhood's overall revenue, it troughed at like 40% like deceleration, right? Like minus 40%. If you look at like Upstart, like peak to trough revenue was something like a 70% drawdown. Right. So that's losing 70% of your business. And then you look at SoFi over that exact same time period, and they are primarily a student, like again, in 2020, they're primarily a student loan lender, and then kind of a personal loan lender after that. And what they like, not only did they not slow down during the exact same circumstances as everybody else, they continued to grow. So I think their execution would have to stop. And I don't think that that's going to happen, especially now that they finally got all these headwinds that are turning into tailwinds. And I just don't see that, like the way that the management was able to pivot the entire company away from something like I use this like it would be if Apple lost the iPhone tomorrow. Like if all of a sudden their iPhone sales went down to from where they are right now to 40% of where they are right now. And you fast forward 2 or 3 years and they've doubled or tripled their revenue. Like that's insane. Or an even better one is Nike, because Nike's actually sucked recently, and but they haven't even, the only thing that they haven't done is not executed. They're losing to competitors, right? And they're losing market share. But 60% of Nike's revenue comes from shoes. So imagine that like Nike tomorrow lost their entire shoe business. Like the US government started giving free shoes away to everybody in the entire United States, right? That's essentially what they did with the student loan moratorium. They said nobody has to pay their student loans anymore. So if the US government, like maybe some people who really love Nike would still go to Foot Locker and would still go buy shoes. But for the most part, like that would suck for Nike if we started giving away free shoes to everybody. But then Nike would have to grow 2 or 3x. They can't even grow 2 or 3x without the headwinds, right? And SoFi has, like, when you just look at the execution and what they've been able to accomplish in the last 3 years relative to what you would expect of that company with those types of headwinds, there's no way they should be where they're at right now. And so that's what gives me so much confidence. And that and the fact that, like, every single bear case. So I mean, I've been writing about SoFi since, the end of 2021, like August, September 2021-ish, I think is when I very first put out my very first article. And like, there have just been bear case after bear case after bear case that people have brought up. And every single one of them, like, hasn't come to pass, right? Like every single last one of them, they've either executed out of it or somebody was essentially just misunderstanding or lying about their company. And so at this point, the 2 bear cases that are like legitimate and that could happen is, number one, if their growth doesn't reaccelerate, right? So like if they turn into, and this would be something that I would be wrong on. So if like this would make me eat crow, is if their revenue does not and their entire business doesn't reaccelerate next year, where they go from, because currently they're going to be somewhere around 20% growth. And if they, in order to hit their guidance, they need to go back up into like high 20s, maybe 30% revenue growth for the next 2 years after that. And if they instead go down to, call it 15% and then 10% the year after that, that would mean, like, that for me would probably mean that I was wrong, because I think that they can execute to the level that they expect. I think that they can hit their guidance. I think that you can trust management to hit their guidance because they've always done it. But if they weren't able to do that, if they missed that guidance that bad, that would be a game changer, right? That would mean that they stopped executing, that they couldn't foresee how their business would grow, and that they didn't understand the market and what they would do. Now, obviously, like if there's a giant recession, right, there can always be mitigating factors. But like if we don't have a massive, huge downturn, if it ends up being a soft landing and they don't get those numbers, that would be a big deal. So growth slowdown is number one. And then number two, the other bear case that I think is legitimate, but I don't think like that wouldn't make me feel like I got something wrong, is just the valuation piece. So like if it continues to just be valued as a bank with like a 1.5 times tangible book, despite the fact that they continue to grow, despite the fact that they're growing earnings, all this, like it's possible and it's feasible. And I can see a reality where they hit their guidance and they're at, call it, 65 cents of EPS in 2026, like they've guided for. And it's still trading around 8 because people say that a bank should be trading at a price to sales of 10. Right. And it'd be around that. It'd be like 12 or something. I think that that's ridiculous, but it might happen.
Sit right there for a second. I was really hoping the conversation would go there. Do you think that Noto deserves a little blame there? Because every time he comes on CNBC, he just laments at how amazing they execute on the banking side of things and kind of glosses over the thing that we're all invested for, which is the technological component of the company. Because I think you said it best on X. SoFi is a technology company that owns a banking charter. And I think that Noto might have even retweeted you or something like the fact that you get it. But he doesn't present SoFi in that way to the general public. So how are they ever going to command this hybrid multiple unless Galileo just comes out of the park? And you look at Galileo as a different sector, and their CAGR, right, their compounded annual growth rate starts growing hand over fist. I feel like there's been a little bit of lack of marketing there, not just from SoFi, but from the entire brass. Whereas Elon has been saying, hey, we're AI, we're robotics for the last 3 to 5 years. And that's why we're getting this multiple. If you don't believe in all of those things, you shouldn't invest in Tesla. So I feel like we need a little more Elon Musky type out of Anthony Noto. And if we can't get it from him, Who can we get it from? Because I feel like that's the only way that we get that multiple that we all invested for. Unless I'm wrong. I mean, did you invest at SoFi's peak?
I mean, no, not exclusively, right? Like if they were just a bank, I wouldn't have, like if banking was their entire thing and they didn't have the technology platform, I don't think I would have invested.
Me neither.
And so, and it, I think everything you just said is really valid criticism, because it is hard. And the other piece that I think is really hard to sell on that, though, is kind of like what Bill was saying, right? Like people don't understand this, right? This isn't something that like you go to somebody, like people get what AI is, they know what robotics are, they can understand conceptually what a a robot or what a full self-driving car would look like. If you come to somebody and say, hey, we've got this super cool modern banking core technology, people are like, what's a banking core, right? Like legitimately. And so it is kind of hard to sell. The interesting thing is like Derek White does a really good job, who's the CEO of Galileo, for those who aren't familiar. He actually does a really good job of putting that vision out there. And if you listen to him, like he can explain that in a way that actually makes it sound really exciting. Because it is, like, in some ways it can be really exciting to be able to help people to serve, because everybody needs a bank account, everybody needs financial products, everybody needs these things, and if you can serve those people in a much better way, like that's actually a really exciting opportunity. And he does a good job talking about like below the glass and above the glass, and if you've ever listened to his podcast. The other thing that's actually been really interesting but has gotten almost no views even within, and no love even within the SoFi investor community, is they've actually started a Galileo podcast series that, and a lot of it is like old interviews they've done from like a year or two ago that they're like releasing every single week. I have felt like through those things, I understand that part of the business like 10 times better than I used to. But if you go onto YouTube and you look at those things, and if you look at the Galileo podcast, it's got like
a few hundred
views. Yeah, 200, 300 views. So like it's not getting any traction, right? Like the people who are watching it are nerds like me, and nobody else. And it's tough, right? Like because it's never going to be a sexy thing. I don't think banking is, like, even if you become a fintech company, if it's B2B, it's not necessarily going to be sexy, because the people you're selling to are banks, right? Like, and so it is kind of hard to do that. But again, Derek White actually does a really good job of doing it. And I think you've got some really fair criticism there, where they need to be able to articulate that in a really distilled way that can tell that story. And you're right that they don't do that very often.